Ned Stark rose before dawn as he did on most days when the world was quiet and Winterfell's ancient walls seemed to hold their breath. The air in the courtyard was chill and a hint of moisture clung to the gray stones beneath his boots. He paced in silence along the battlements, half lost in recollections. He thought of Robert, the man once so full of laughter and rage, the man he had followed into rebellion and into ruin. He wondered if he had done right by him, by the realm, by the memories they had forged. Even in the half-light of the new day, Ned's countenance was grave, as though he carried the weight of unspoken secrets. He had not expected the raven. When the messenger had come, wind-blown, trembling, insisting upon an immediate audience, Ned assumed, as he always did these days, that it must bear dire news from King's Landing. Since King Robert had died, every bit of word from the south was like a slash in old scars. Joffrey had ascended the Iron Throne, and the realm had seen new strife in every direction. Yet as the messenger fumbled for a sealed parchment, Ned glimpsed not the mocking lion of Lannister, nor the crowned stag of Baratheon, but a dragon's sigil pressed into the wax. It caught what little daylight there was and gleamed in the gloom. He accepted the message in the privacy of the Lord Solar. The doors closed behind him, the echo reverberated through the old wooden beams. Ned's breath came slow, steady, as he broke the seal and scanned the words. What he saw stunned him more than any southern news could have. He read the words once, then again, each line stirring conflicting emotions in his chest. The letter claimed to be from Daenerys Targaryen, last scion of the deposed Targaryen dynasty and the so-called Mother of Dragons. She had written of Westeros, of her intentions, of her losses. Most inconceivable of all, she had written of Robert Baratheon, as if she could call upon his memory rather than his hatred. She asked for an alliance. Not an empty vow or a hollow pledge, but a chance to parley. She invoked the honor of House Stark, the legacy of the rebellion, and her own desire to claim the Iron Throne as the rightful queen. But what truly shook Ned was the tone of the words. There was no petulance, no megalomania that one might expect from the daughter of the Mad King. Instead, there was a quiet resolution, a willingness to consider old wounds and, perhaps, to let them mend. She wrote that she was aware of the horrors the Mad King had inflicted on the Starks. She wrote that she held no illusions about the violence that had befallen her family. And she wrote that Robert Baratheon's memory need not be one of endless vengeance but of a man who, despite his hatred of Targaryens, wanted to see a united Westeros free of tyranny. Somehow she appealed to that sense. She appealed to Ned Stark's sense of duty to the realm, a realm threatened by forces both known and unknown. Ned closed his eyes. He thought of Robert's fury whenever the Targaryen name had been spoken. The fierce, near-fanatical vow to kill every last Targaryen child had once been enough to drive a wedge between friends. And yet here he was, reading a letter from the very Targaryen that had escaped Robert's retribution, speaking of forging a new path. He set the letter aside and stared at the flickering candle. If Daenerys Targaryen landed in Westeros with dragons at her side, she would throw the realm into chaos unless, perhaps, she had allies who could guide her. Allies from the north who knew how to stand steadfast when winter threatened. Allies who might coax her toward a measured approach rather than a brutal conquest. He knew he could not take this lightly. Word of the letter would have to remain secret for as long as possible. The Lannisters would not abide a Stark, Targaryen pact, nor would the Tyrells or any of the southern houses that had grown comfortable under the rule of a Baratheon lion regime. A quiet knock at the solar door shook him from these thoughts. Maester Luwin entered, eyes inquisitive behind his chain collar as though he sensed something monumental had transpired. Ned handed him the scroll without a word. He watched the old maester's face tighten, relax, tighten again, and at last settle into a state of rare amazement. "Is it genuine?" Ned asked in a near whisper. Maester Luwin let out a careful breath. "It appears genuine, my lord. I see no sign of forgery and the seal is quite unique." He cast his gaze to the small round of black wax, marked with three-headed dragons. "If this is not from the Targaryen queen, then it is an elaborate hoax. But the style, it matches what we have heard of her. And the messenger was from the east, was he not?" Ned nodded. "He came by ship to White Harbor and carried this on horseback, presumably under great risk." Maester Luwin's eyes flickered. "Indeed. Shall I share this with the other lords of the north?" "No," said Ned firmly. "Not yet. For now, the matter must remain between us." He paused to absorb the gravity of what he was about to say. "Send word back. Write with care, Maester. I will receive her. Or rather, I will send someone to meet her in Essos quietly, away from the eyes of the realm. But be certain she understands that this is not a vow of fealty or a promise of any kind. Only a willingness to talk." When Maester Luwin left, Ned felt as though he had stepped onto a precarious ridge. He was choosing a course that Robert would have despised. Yet Robert was gone and the realm had changed. He would do as he always had, follow his sense of honor, even if it led him to dangerous places. He summoned Robb, his heir, to discuss the matter. In the high seat of Winterfell's great hall, father and son spoke in hushed tones. The morning light spilled in through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Robb's brow furrowed at the mention of Daenerys. "Father, are you certain?" The Targaryens, he trailed off, remembering lessons about the Mad King, the war, the fire, and blood. Ned held his gaze. "I am not certain of anything except that times are changing. Joffrey sits the Iron Throne. Our allies in the south have grown uneasy. The realm bleeds one corner after another. And beyond that, winter comes. If Daenerys Targaryen truly brings dragons, do we want her as an enemy? Would we not rather see if she might be turned into an ally?" Robb breathed in slowly, the ghost of his boyhood behind the eyes that had seen war's cruelty. He seemed to measure his father's words. "You speak true, father. But the North remembers what the Mad King did. Many will not take kindly to this." Ned exhaled. "That is why we must keep it close. There is more at stake here than old grudges. Daenerys says she hopes to restore Westeros, not rule by fear. She claims to remember Robert, though not as the man who fought her family, but as the man who wanted a stable kingdom. I cannot know if that is genuine, but I would like to find out before she sails west with dragons and an army of Sellswords." Robb nodded, subdued. "Who will you send to meet her?" "I have thought of traveling myself," Ned began, then paused at the look of alarm that crossed Robb's face. "But I do not think that wise. The Warden of the North cannot simply vanish. There is too much at stake here, especially with the Lannisters. Better that we send someone we trust, someone who can speak with my voice, but whose departure will not raise immediate suspicion." Robb considered. "A small company, then? Perhaps Uncle Benjen?" A shadow passed over Ned's eyes. Benjen had gone missing beyond the wall some time ago. Rumor after rumor had circulated, but no truth had come. Ned had not lost hope, but the ache remained. He drew in a breath. "We cannot. Uncle Benjen is lost to us, at least for the moment. We must think of another. Someone with a steady head, but also someone Daenerys might respect." Robb opened his mouth as if to volunteer, but Ned shook his head gently. "You cannot leave the North. You are my heir, and your duties here grow by the day. I think it must be Ser Jorah Mormont if he can be found." Robb's eyes flickered at the mention of the disgraced knight, exiled for selling poachers into slavery. "Do you trust him, father?" Ned's mouth tightened. He had never approved of Jorah's crimes, but Jorah hailed from House Mormont, loyal bannermen to the Starks for generations. And rumor had it he had once served Daenerys Targaryen as an advisor of sorts in Essos. "No," Ned said quietly. "I do not trust him. But he knows her if the stories are true. He knows Essos, and he is a man of the North by blood. If we can bring him into our confidence, perhaps that alone would prove to her our sincerity." Robb let out a measured breath. "It is a risk." Ned nodded. "All of this is risk. But this letter has opened a door I never thought could be opened. We must walk through it or watch it close forever." In the following days, Ned took care to move discreetly. He dispatched maesters and loyal riders to track Jorah Mormont's whereabouts. Meanwhile, the ravens that flew out of Winterfell carried only mundane messages to the other lords, carefully avoiding any mention of Targaryens. The hush that settled over the castle felt eerie. It was as though Winterfell itself sensed the magnitude of what was unfolding behind closed doors. The only outward sign of Ned's burden was in the eyes of the people closest to him, Robb, Maester Luwin, and Catelyn. Her intuition had told her something was amiss, and Ned had at last shared a portion of the truth. Catelyn had pressed her lips tight at the mention of Daenerys. She remembered the Mad King's cruelty, and even more so, the stories of his heirs. But she also recognized the precarious state of the realm. There was no easy path. "If you do this, Ned, it must be done with utmost secrecy," she said to him one night as they retired to their chambers. "The Lannisters will declare you a traitor if they learn of it. The Tyrells may do the same. You know how the realm fears the return of dragons." Ned laid a hand atop hers. "We stand on uncertain ground no matter what we do. But I believe if we can shape Daenerys' return, guide her to a more peaceful path, then perhaps we can spare the realm more bloodshed. At least the blood of innocence. The great war that might come from the north, that is another matter." She squeezed his fingers, gazing up into his gray eyes with a mixture of worry and resolve. "Then let us pray the gods show us mercy." It was not many days later that a new raven arrived, bearing the news that Jorah Mormont was indeed in Essos near Meereen, and that he still held some position, albeit precarious, at Daenerys' side. Ned read the note with an odd sense of relief. If Yora was near her, then it would be simpler to arrange a meeting. The next step was to prepare a small, trusted group to sail from White Harbor to meet Daenerys' emissaries. Eventually, if all went well, perhaps they would stand in her presence. But before final plans were made, Ned received another letter, this one clearly from Daenerys herself, but delivered by a hooded courier who arrived at Winterfell unannounced and demanded to see him. The man, thin and weather-worn, offered a sealed parchment with trembling hands. When Ned broke it open, his eyes flickered with curiosity. The Targaryen queen had already learned that Ned was seeking Yora. She wrote that she took this as a sign of good faith. She suggested a meeting place in Braavos, a neutral city, neither too close to Meereen nor too close to Westeros. She claimed to have confidants in Braavos who could ensure her safety and, presumably, Ned's representative's safety as well. Ned rubbed his chin as he reread the proposition. Braavos was, in many ways, a wise choice. It was far away from the eyes of King's Landing and the Lannisters, and if anything went wrong, Daenerys could slip back to Essos without being trapped. The idea of meeting in the city of the Titan had a certain symmetry. Two Braavos had once offered a haven to so many exiles, and even the Targaryens had once secured loans from the Iron Bank. There would be no illusions about who held the power there. Yet it was also a risk. Sending envoys that far across the sea would take time, and the sea lanes were never truly safe. Worse still, if the Lannisters caught wind of it, they might intercept any ship they suspected of harboring Targaryen conspirators. If Ned was deemed a traitor, the North could be placed in jeopardy, giving the South an excuse to march on Winterfell. He tapped his fingers against the table in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Each tap felt like a heartbeat of doubt. That evening, he gathered Catelyn, Robb, Maester Luwin, and a few other loyal advisors to discuss the matter. They sat around the long oak table in a chamber lit by flickering torches. Shadows danced across their faces, shaping their expressions into masks of tension and determination. Daenerys suggests Braavos, Ned began, voice low. It is neutral ground. My instinct says to accept. But we must be prepared for every possibility. We must prepare contingencies in case news leaks to the Iron Throne or to any house that might wish to see us undone. Robb leaned forward, arms crossed. We can cloak the voyage in secrecy. Send a small ship out of White Harbor, perhaps under the banner of a merchant or lesser noble loyal to us. If we are questioned, we can claim trade expeditions. But if we do this, we must be sure we can move swiftly. The less time we linger, the better. Catelyn's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. And who will lead this envoy? We spoke of Ser Jorah, but if he remains in Daenerys' camp, who do we send to represent the North? We cannot risk sending you, Ned. Your place is here, where you can maintain the facade that everything is as it always was. Ned nodded. I will remain. But we need someone who understands diplomacy, who understands the North, and who can handle themselves if things turn foul. His gaze drifted to Robb. He wanted to protect his son, but he also knew that the boy had taken on the mantle of a man. You are the heir of Winterfell, Robb. Your presence would show the Targaryen queen that we are serious. Yet if I lose you, Robb spoke gently, a ghost of a smile on his lips. You won't lose me, father. I would go if you wish it. Catelyn's face betrayed a momentary pang of dread. She had already lost too much, had risked too much. If Robb goes, let him be accompanied by men we trust. The Great Jon, perhaps, and a few others. But not too many. Ned's mind churned. A small retinue would be best. No more than a handful of loyal men sworn to secrecy under penalty of death. If things go ill, we cannot afford to lose half our northern strength in one stroke. So it was decided. Robb Stark would lead a discreet band to sail from White Harbor to Braavos, where they would meet Daenerys Targaryen or her representatives. They would open a dialogue, see if she was true in her stated intentions, and return with news. The plan had an undercurrent of hope that Ned had not felt in a long time, something that Robert's memory might have once savored, a chance to avoid unbridled war. Yet it also made Ned's heart pound with the weight of possibility. If Daenerys proved false, if she intended to use the North as a stepping stone to ruthless conquest, then he would have walked straight into her snare. He steadied himself. Honor demanded that he try. A fortnight later, Robb departed Winterfell with a small group of trusted men. He left under the cover of dawn, each of them clad in plain traveling clothes rather than the colors of House Stark. If any watchers in the castle asked where they went, they were told only that the young lord was responding to a small matter of trade negotiations in White Harbor. None openly questioned it. Robb was known to oversee shipments of grain and iron now that the winter threatened to tighten its grip on the North. Ned stood at the gates as he watched his son ride away. The hoarfrost clung to the stony ramparts, and the breath of the riders steamed in the cold morning light. Beside him, Caitlin shivered, though not from the temperature alone. She watched the party vanish into the trees, the silence looming in the still air long after they disappeared from sight. In his heart, Ned prayed to the old gods for his son's safe return. He prayed for the realm, too, for the day that might come when a Targaryen queen and the Starks could stand side by side rather than at each other's throats. Then he clenched his jaw, buried the flickers of doubt, and turned back into the keep. Work awaited him, and winter was coming. Bravos! To Robb Stark, it was like stepping onto another world. He had grown up in the snowy courtyards of Winterfell among pine forests and gray skies. Bravos was a city of water, of twisting canals and slender bridges, of dark alleys and wide, moonlit lagoons. At its mouth stood the Titan, towering above the entrance, guarding the city from naval threat. Robb's ship rode under its stone gaze, and he could not help but feel small and exposed. His retinue consisted of the great Jon Umber, albeit under a pseudonym, and 3 other men of the North who had proven their loyalty time and again: Hallis Malin, Wylis Manderly, and a quiet, sharp-eyed soldier named Trevin who had served House Stark for a decade. Each wore cloaks dyed in subdued colors, free of the wolf's head sigil, and the sails of their ship bore no insignia. They were merchants in name, albeit heavily armed for merchants. They secured lodging in a modest inn near the Purple Harbor. The proprietor asked no questions, accustomed to travelers of all kinds. Yet from the moment they set foot on the wooden docks, Robb felt eyes upon them. Bravos was rumored to have as many spies as it had fish in the lagoon, and with Daenerys Targaryen's name whispered among certain corners, it would be no surprise if men loyal to her were already watching. That suspicion was confirmed 2 days later, when a slender, hooded figure approached Robb as he walked the narrow streets with Hallis Malin. The figure gave a shallow bow, whispered something in Braavosi about a private boat waiting for him at the western dock after sunset. Then, without waiting for a reply, the figure slipped away into the crowd. Robb and Hallis exchanged glances. "Seems our hostess wishes to speak," Hallis said, one hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Robb nodded. His pulse quickened. This was it, the reason they had come so far. If Daenerys Targaryen was truly here, or had representatives here, they would now learn if her intentions were honorable. They returned to the inn, gathered the other men, and prepared themselves. Night fell, and the city's lanterns reflected on the dark waters, shimmering like ghosts. They donned plain cloaks and headed toward the designated dock. A small boat waited, an ornate vessel with a lantern on its prow. A Braavosi oarsman in a feathered cap beckoned them without a word. Robb hesitated for just a heartbeat, then climbed aboard, the great Jon and the others at his back. The boat glided through the dark canals, beneath graceful bridges and past looming palazzos. The sounds of distant revelry echoed across the water. Music, laughter, the clink of glasses in taverns. Yet the route they took seemed quiet, winding away from the main thoroughfares. At last, the boat emerged into a wider waterway, where a solitary dock extended into the lagoon, fronted by a low building of dark stone. A single torch burned near the entrance. A figure stood beside it, face half hidden by flickering shadows. As Robb and his men stepped onto the dock, the figure approached, another hood drawn low. Then, a soft, feminine voice spoke. "Lord Robb Stark," she said, her common tongue precise but tinged with a foreign lilt. Robb bowed his head. "I am he. And you?" She lowered her hood, revealing a woman with deep amber eyes and curling hair the color of onyx. Her skin was olive-toned, her posture poised. "I am Missandei, handmaiden and advisor to Daenerys Targaryen." She gestured toward the stone building behind her. "My queen awaits inside." Robb's heart thumped at the confirmation that Daenerys was indeed in Bravos. He exchanged a glance with the great Jon, who took a step to his side, hand resting near his sword hilt in case of treachery. Yet the night was calm, and the only men he saw were 2 unsullied guards flanking the wooden door, eunuchs with spears and shields, rumored to be among the finest soldiers in the world. Missandei led them inside. The interior was sparsely furnished, with a few tables and chairs, a handful of flickering lanterns, and the faint echo of water dripping in unseen corners. At the far end, seated in a high-backed chair, was Daenerys Targaryen. She rose when Robb approached, her silver-gold hair illuminated by the warm glow of lamplight. She wore a simple yet elegant gown that accentuated her regal bearing without flaunting it. As Robb and his men crossed the threshold, the 2 unsullied stationed themselves by the door, silent sentinels. Daenerys inclined her head in a respectful greeting. "Lord Robb Stark," she said, her tone holding neither triumph nor pride but something akin to earnest interest. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen." Robb bowed, the Great Jon and the others following suit. "Your Grace," Robb said, then straightened. His voice carried the careful neutrality his father had taught him. "I bring greetings from my father, Eddard Stark, Warden of the North." Her violet eyes flickered at the name. "I am grateful that he sent you. I understand it was no small risk for you to come." Robb studied her face. She was younger than he expected, but there was a quiet steadiness in her gaze. So much power in such a small frame. He thought of the stories of the Mad King and wondered if madness might lurk beneath the surface. But all he saw was resolve. "It was a necessary risk," he replied. "We have come to learn if your intentions are what you claim." Daenerys gestured to a table and chairs arranged in a semicircle. "Let us sit. We have much to speak of, and I would have it done openly." They seated themselves, Robb and Daenerys across from each other, Missandei and the Northmen forming a careful perimeter. There was no food, no wine, and the lamplight cast elongated shadows across the rough stone walls. Robb was keenly aware of how alone they were, how at Daenerys' mercy they might be, yet she had invited him here without show of force. She had not brought an army. Only 2 unsullied stood guard, and Missandei's presence suggested she was not seeking to hide behind multiple layers of courtiers. "Your father's name carries much weight," Daenerys began. "He has a reputation for honor, for kindness, and for loyalty to the realm. That is why I reached out to him." Robb nodded, studying her posture. "We received your letters. You speak of forging a new future, of recalling Robert Baratheon's hope for a stable kingdom rather than his hatred for your family. Why should we believe this is genuine?" Daenerys' eyes did not waver. "Because I have seen enough hatred to know it leads nowhere good. My family's history is soaked in blood, yet so is the history of the Baratheons, of the Lannisters, of every house that has waged war. I do not claim my father's crimes as my own, nor do I seek to deny them. But I do claim the hope that a Targaryen might rule differently, especially with the council of houses that hold honor dear. Your house stands among them." She took a measured breath. "When I was a girl, my brother Viserys taught me only of revenge. But he is gone now. I have walked through fire and lost much, but I have also gained a new perspective. I do not wish to lay waste to Westeros. I wish to free it from tyranny. The Iron Throne belongs to me by right, but I will not rule as the Mad King did. I believe your father understands that war is not always the only answer." Robb considered her words. "The realm is deeply suspicious of Targaryens. The North remembers the execution of my grandfather and uncle in King Aerys' throne room. Many in the realm fear a return to madness or that you might exact revenge for Robert's rebellion." Daenerys' face shadowed at that. "I understand, and I do not ask for blind faith, only a chance to prove otherwise. Would you and your father rather face me as an enemy or stand beside me as a friend to shape my rule?" Robb exhaled slowly. The directness of her question felt oddly refreshing. "If you speak truly, my father believes it would be better for the realm if you returned with allies who can keep you from repeating old sins. He has misgivings, but he also sees that the Lannisters grow bolder and more dangerous with every passing day. They have the ear of the Iron Throne. They have a grip on the South, and the North has always stood apart." He paused, looking at her intently. "We also face other threats, some that cannot be ignored." Her brows furrowed. "I have heard rumors, but not enough." "What threats do you speak of?" Robb inhaled, deciding how much to reveal. He recalled Jon's warnings about the White Walkers, the strange sightings beyond the Wall, the sense of creeping doom that had begun to plague the North. "In the lands beyond the Wall, there are dark forces gathering, creatures older than our memory. My uncle was lost there. Many rangers have disappeared. We believe the danger is real and it does not care for thrones or crowns." Daenerys listened, her face earnest. "I have heard faint whispers of an ancient evil, but I did not know how seriously to take them. Dragons have returned to the world. Perhaps other old things have awakened too." Robb felt a chill at how simply she acknowledged the possibility. "Yes, this is not a conflict that can be solved with political maneuvering. It threatens all the living. That is another reason my father considered your offer. If you truly have dragons, you might hold the key to saving us all from the winter that creeps down from the far north." Daenerys' violet eyes seemed to brighten with a touch of awe or perhaps a recognition of the gravity of it all. "The dragons are young still, but they grow, and with them my power grows. But I do not desire to conquer a shattered realm. I wish to unify it. If that unification must begin by defending against a threat far greater than anything from the south, then so be it." Robb nodded gravely. My father wants to know what your intentions are for the great houses that opposed your father. If you land in Westeros, will you demand their heads? Or will you seek to mend old rifts? Daenerys' jaw tightened a fraction. I will demand justice for crimes committed, but not blind retribution. I have learned that mercy can be powerful in forging alliances. If any of them mean to bend the knee and help me build a better Westeros, I will spare them. I do not relish the idea of burning cities or crucifying lords. I have seen enough of that in my travels. Robb caught the echo of old pain in her voice. She had presumably seen horrors in Essos' slave cities, tyrants. He could sense sincerity. Still, sincerity in a quiet room under the watchful eyes of two unsullied and a handful of northern swords was easy to profess. Could she maintain it once she stepped onto the shores of Westeros, confronted by old foes and new grudges? Silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the drip of water in some unseen canal beneath the floor. Then Robb spoke. You said in your letter you invoked King Robert's memory in a different light. What did you mean by that? A sad smile tugged at the corner of Daenerys' lips. I was a child in exile, taught that Robert was the usurper, the monster who destroyed my family. But as I grew older, I heard tales of him as a young man, brave, strong, loyal to his friends, especially to your father. I also heard that he fought for justice against a king who had grown mad. I began to realize that Robert's fight was not merely about stealing the throne, but about ending a cruel reign. Had my father not descended into madness, perhaps there would have been no rebellion. Over time, I came to understand that Robert's hatred of Targaryens was not born in a void, it was born from the horrors inflicted by my father. He hated me for the name I bear, but perhaps had he lived long enough to see me, he might have understood that I am not the Mad King. Robb's expression was thoughtful, tinged with a quiet sadness of his own. Robert was a complicated man. My father loved him once as a brother. But that same father taught me to judge people by their own actions, not just those of their kin. I suppose that is why he opened the door to you. Daenerys dipped her head in acknowledgement. I hope to earn that trust. They spoke for hours more, exchanging tidings of the realm and clarifying each other's positions. Daenerys asked about the north, the loyalty of the banner men, the state of the roads, the mood of the smallfolk. Robb in turn asked about her armies in Essos, the loyalty of the freedmen who followed her, the nature of her dragons. Through it all, Missandei quietly interjected details or clarifications, her voice calm and measured. Eventually, the first gray hints of dawn filtered through the cracks in the shutters. Daenerys rose to her feet. Robb and his men stood as well, stiff from hours of cautious conversation. Outside, the waters of Braavos would be turning from inky black to steel gray, and the city would soon awaken. It is nearly morning, Daenerys said, a mild fatigue in her voice. Go, rest. When night falls again, I would speak with you further. We should not remain here once the city is fully awake. I have taken pains to avoid drawing attention to myself. I trust you have as well. Robb ran a hand over his face, feeling the bite of exhaustion. We have. My men and I will return to our inn. We will come back when the sun is low. Daenerys inclined her head. Until then. Before Robb turned to leave, Daenerys added softly, tell your father that I do not seek the destruction of the Starks. I seek their friendship. And I promise him on my name and on the memory of my lost kin that I will not become what he fears. Robb watched her for a moment. He saw a flicker of vulnerability behind her regal composure, as if she, too, was taking a leap of faith. Then he gave a short bow. I will relay your words, your grace. The boat ride back through the canals felt strangely surreal to Robb. The Grey Jon, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the meeting, finally let out a huff of air as they glided in near silence. Well, she's not what I expected, he muttered. I was thinking she'd be fierce as a she-wolf with teeth bared. But she was calm almost. Robb nodded. She has fire in her, I can sense it. But she holds it in check. And she speaks with conviction. It's enough to make me believe she truly wants to avoid bloodshed, though I have no doubt she'd spill it if she thought it necessary. Hallis Malin rubbed his eyes. What do we tell Lord Eddard? Robb sighed. We tell him she seems genuine. But we've only just begun. Let's see what else she reveals tonight. That evening, they returned to the same dock to find Missandei waiting. She led them into the stone building again. This time, Daenerys had prepared a modest meal, bread, salted fish, watered wine. They ate quickly, exchanging more questions. Robb sensed that she was testing him, gauging how far the North's loyalty might extend, how deep their grievances ran. He, in turn, sought to glean her true ambitions. Was she content to claim the Iron Throne and restore peace, or did she harbor a desire to punish those who had wronged the Targaryens? At length, Daenerys gestured for Missandei to bring forth a rolled parchment. Missandei placed it on the table, unbound it, and revealed a carefully written text. Daenerys tapped the first lines with a slender finger. I propose this as a first draft of terms between House Targaryen and House Stark should the North choose to ally with me in my claim to the throne. Robb's eyes widened. He had not expected such a formal step so soon. The great Jon leaned forward, furrowing his brow. Missandei read the terms aloud. First, House Stark pledges not to raise arms against House Targaryen in any claim to the Iron Throne. Second, House Targaryen recognizes the North's right to self-govern in matters of local rule and swears to preserve the traditions of the North. Third, House Stark, with the blessing of its bannermen, will support House Targaryen's peaceful reclamation of the Iron Throne, provided that no atrocities are committed against innocent citizens. Fourth, if forced into open war by the Lannisters or other opposing forces, House Targaryen commits to spare the domains of House Stark from unnecessary destruction, and likewise, House Stark commits to aid House Targaryen's forces as needed. Fifth, upon her successful ascension, Daenerys Targaryen will appoint representatives from the North to her small council to ensure that Northern interests are protected. The room fell silent after the reading. Robb's heart pounded. These terms were more than generous. They essentially promised a great deal of autonomy for the North, a recognition that no king in the South had offered since the Targaryens first conquered the continent generations ago. He glanced at the great Jon, who looked both amazed and suspicious. Daenerys leaned forward. I understand that your father must review these terms and that nothing can be decided here and now. But let this be a sign of good faith. I do not seek to reignite the cruelty of the past. I seek to usher in a new age. Robb managed a steady voice. I will return this to my father. He will consult with the bannermen. But if you fulfill these promises, I believe the North would find itself inclined to support you. We care for the realm, and we despise the Lannisters' hold on the throne as much as anyone. That said, I must be candid, the memory of the Mad King burns bright in the North. We will need more than parchment to convince our people. Daenerys nodded solemnly. I know. In return, I will offer this. I will meet your father in person. Not in the Red Keep, not with an army at my back, but in some neutral place we both trust. Perhaps even Winterfell if you and he would have me. The suggestion took Robb by surprise. The idea of a Targaryen queen standing in the halls of Winterfell seemed so alien, so fraught with historical tensions. And yet it might also be the strongest gesture of peace she could offer. He glanced at her dragons. Well, he could not see them here, but he knew they existed and imagined them flying over the North's snow-covered plains. It was a daunting thought, but also a potent one. I will carry your offer to my father, he said at last. But the journey to Winterfell is long, and your arrival could not be kept secret. It may be safer to choose a different location, perhaps even White Harbor. She inclined her head in acceptance. Wherever he chooses, I am willing to come. But that will come later, I think. For now, let us continue this conversation through letters and envoys. I am not yet prepared to sail for Westeros, but I will soon be. When I do, I want to know that I have at least one great house willing to meet me with open hands. Robb stood, his posture resolving into a confident stance. Then we have a start, your grace. I will return to the North as soon as we can sail. May I have your leave to depart? Daenerys rose as well. Yes. And thank you, Lord Stark, for coming all this way. I know what it cost you to do so. He dipped his head. Farewell for now. With that, the Northmen departed into the Braavosi night. Robb felt the first glimmer of cautious hope stirring in his chest. This meeting had gone better than he could have imagined. The terms Daenerys offered were generous, perhaps too generous, some would say. And yet she seemed earnest. If the North allied with her, they might shape her claim in a way that would protect their interests and possibly spare the realm a great deal of bloodshed. A fortnight later, Robb set sail from Braavos. He and his men navigated the choppy waters of the narrow sea, wary of pirates or worse. The journey was largely uneventful, though tension never left them as they considered how the realm might react if news of their mission reached the wrong ears. At last, the White Harbor docks came into view and the men breathed sighs of relief. They rode hard for Winterfell, their horses lathered in sweat by the time the gray walls appeared on the horizon. Snow dusted the ramparts and the wind carried the sharp tang of frost. Robb felt a surge of warmth at the sight of his home. Guards at the gate recognized them and swung the doors wide. Word spread quickly that the young lord had returned. Servants bustled about, stable hands rushed to tend the horses, and the courtyard filled with the whispered question, "What news from the south?" Robb went straight to the solar where his father awaited. Ned's hair looked a bit more gray than when Robb had left, and the lines around his mouth deeper. But he clasped Robb's shoulders as soon as he entered. "Welcome home, my son," Ned said quietly, relief evident in his voice. Robb allowed himself a small smile. "It is good to be back. I bring more than I expected." He withdrew the parchment from Daenerys, the proposed treaty, and handed it to Ned. "Read this." She gave it to me in Braavos, where we met in secret. Ned's eyes flickered as he scanned the terms. His brows rose slightly at certain lines, and by the time he reached the end, he looked up at Robb with measured astonishment. "These are quite generous if they are genuine." Robb met his father's gaze. "I believe she is sincere. She carries herself with a gravity I did not expect. She did not demand homage. She offered friendship, an alliance. She spoke of Robert Baratheon as a man who fought a just cause against her father's madness, and she does not blame you or the North for that war. She only asks that we do not hold her accountable for the sins of her father." Ned inhaled slowly, setting the parchment aside. If she stays true to these words, then a Stark or Targaryen pact might indeed spare the realm a great deal of suffering. Robb nodded. She also mentioned another threat, the White Walkers. She believes us when we say there are evils stirring in the far north. She speaks of her dragons as a possible counter to such threats. Ned's hand tightened on the parchment. The faint glow of the hearth caught the seriousness in his eyes. "Then she does not think us mad for fearing the return of legends?" "She does not," Robb confirmed. "She's seen wonders and horrors in Essos that defy understanding. She was open to the possibility that other ancient powers might be awakening too." Ned's gaze moved to the flames in the hearth, the flicker of orange reflecting in his gray eyes. "This might be the chance we prayed for, then. If we can unite the realm behind a common purpose, and if Daenerys Targaryen truly wishes to rule justly, perhaps we can avoid the ruin that war would bring." Robb allowed himself to release some of the tension that had built during his travels. "Father, do you think we can trust her?" Ned stared into the fire for a long moment before turning back to his son. "Trust must be earned, but we can give her the chance to earn it. If she honors her word, the North will do the same. And if she can bring dragons to bear against the coming winter, we may have no choice but to stand with her if we hope to survive what lies beyond the wall." Robb nodded, remembering Daenerys's calm eyes, the subdued power beneath them. "Then we shall begin drafting our response. She mentioned she's open to meeting you in person, though she advised caution given the eyes of King's Landing." Ned's jaw tensed at the thought of the Lannisters learning of a Targaryen Stark pact. "We will choose the time and place carefully. For now, we will write to her, acknowledging her offer and setting out our terms. Let it be known that while we do not declare fealty outright, we stand ready to help her restore balance, if she proves worthy of that trust." Robb felt the faint stirrings of hope, mixed with trepidation, swirl in his chest. "We will need to bring the Bannermen into confidence eventually. Some of them will be outraged, others may be cautious. But if we can present this alliance as a means to protect the North and quell the Lannisters, we might gain acceptance." Ned placed a hand on Robb's shoulder, a rare gesture of fatherly reassurance. "One step at a time, my son. Let us first secure the lines of communication with Daenerys. We will see how the realm shifts in response to this quiet understanding. And we will pray that we do not awaken a new war we cannot contain." Thus, the Starks began their dance with the Targaryen queen. Messages traveled across the sea via trusted ships, each bearing careful missives that set out boundary lines and cautious hopes. Daenerys replied in kind, offering updates on the growth of her dragons, the loyalty of her Unsullied, and her efforts to stabilize the freed cities she left behind. Slowly, a fragile trust took shape. The North, battered by rumors of White Walkers and Whites, found itself strangely aligned with a Targaryen queen who claimed to wield fire that might drive back the endless cold. Over the following months, Ned maneuvered quietly among the northern lords. He explained, in broad strokes, that the time might come to consider an accord with Daenerys Targaryen. He reminded them that House Stark did not forget the atrocities committed by the Mad King, but insisted that the sins of the father need not be laid upon the daughter. Some stood in cautious agreement. Others balked at the idea of welcoming a Targaryen. But as tales of Lannister brutality in the Riverlands spread, as whispers of new levies forming in King's Landing reached the north, and as the nights grew longer and colder, more and more lords began to see sense in forging a new path. Meanwhile, Daenerys prepared in Essos. She gathered ships, forging alliances with powerful captains who had once feared the Dothraki. She consolidated her rule in Meereen and Slaver's Bay, ensuring that no rebellion would force her to stay behind. She told her closest advisors and her growing cadre of knights and commanders that when she sailed for Westeros, her first step would not be to set King's Landing ablaze, but to meet with the Starks. To show the realm that her war was not with the innocent, but with the usurpers who had turned the throne into a seat of greed and treachery. Yet even as the outlines of this alliance solidified, new uncertainties arose. Word trickled across the sea that the Lannisters, led by the cunning Queen Regent Cersei, had begun to suspect the North's involvement with Daenerys. Rumors abounded of spies in White Harbor, of gold changing hands for information. Ships flying the Lion's banner were spotted sailing the narrow sea, presumably in search of Targaryen sightings. Tensions mounted quietly as though the realm stood on the edge of a blade. In Winterfell's Godwood, Ned Stark knelt before the heart tree, the ancient weirwood with its solemn face carved into the trunk. Snow gathered on the silent branches overhead. The faint hush of the wind was all that stirred the stillness of the sacred place. Ned bowed his head, praying for guidance, for strength in the face of the storms to come. He felt the old gods watching. He thought of Robert then. He remembered the roars of laughter, the fists slammed on tables over jugs of ale, the boisterous hunts, and the camaraderie forged in the fires of rebellion. And he remembered, too, the bitterness that had grown in Robert's heart toward the Targaryens, the vow never to rest until they were all gone. Could Robert, in some distant afterlife, see what Ned was about to do? Could he forgive this betrayal of their old oath to wipe out the dragon's blood? Or would he understand the necessity? Ned rose, a scattering of snow drifting from his cloak. If Robert could speak to him now, perhaps he would rage at first, but maybe, just maybe, he would relent upon seeing what his old friend was trying to save. The realm deserved better than endless war. Perhaps Robert's memory could be something more than an echo of hatred. Perhaps it could be a testament to what men of honor once fought for, a kingdom free of fear and tyranny. That, Ned decided, was worth risking everything. Time pressed on. Daenerys wrote that her ships were ready. She would soon embark on the voyage across the narrow sea, but her first landing would not be in Dorne, nor the Stormlands, nor King's Landing. She had selected a remote cove along the eastern coast of the north, near the Bight, far from prying eyes. She requested safe passage, a guarantee that the Starks would not betray her landing to the Iron Throne. In return, she would come in peace with only a fraction of her forces, enough to protect herself but not to threaten the north. Her dragons, she warned, would come too, for she could not leave them behind. But she promised they would not wreak havoc. The day of her landing dawned clear and cold. Ned stood on a windswept cliff overlooking the biting sea, flanked by Robb, the Great John, and a retinue of Stark soldiers. Far below, the waves crashed against the rocks. White Harbor ships, loyal to House Stark, patrolled the waters. The sun hung low in the sky, thin and pale, offering little warmth. Then, on the horizon, sails appeared. A small fleet, perhaps a dozen ships in all, approached the cove. Ned's heart thudded in his chest as he remembered how long the Targaryens had been exiles, how determined Robert had been to kill any heirs. And now here they came, under Ned Stark's protection, to forge a new future. He prayed the gods were kind. Robb stood beside him, face set in a mask of solemn composure. "Father," he said quietly, "are we doing the right thing?" Ned glanced at his son. "We do what we must for the realm. It is all we can do." Then he spotted motion overhead. "Look!" A dark shape soared across the sky, circling above the incoming ships. Ned squinted, marveling at the creature's presence. It was a dragon, sinuous and powerful, wings spread wide. A swirl of mingled fear and a rippled through the Northmen standing guard. Some muttered prayers, others gripped their swords. They had heard the stories, but seeing a dragon with their own eyes was another matter. Ned kept his composure, turning to address his men. "Hold your ground. Let no one draw steel unless we are attacked." He spoke firmly, and the soldiers nodded, though their eyes never left the circling beast. The ships drew closer, and soon rowboats splashed into the water, ferrying men and women to the shore. Ned descended the cliff path, Robb and their guards behind him, to meet Daenerys Targaryen on the pebbled beach. The cold wind whipped at cloaks and hair, and the sound of waves crashing onto shore mingled with the distant roar of the dragon overhead. When Daenerys stepped onto the sand, she was flanked by a handful of warriors unsullied, their discipline visible in every measured stride. At her side was Missandei, her features set in composed vigilance. Behind them came a tall knight in black armor tinted with gold, a man Ned recognized from descriptions as Ser Barristan Selmy, once a Kingsguard loyal to King Aerys, then to King Robert, and now, apparently, to Daenerys. Ned and Robb approached, and Daenerys' gaze settled on them. Behind her, on the ships, more men and supplies waited. But for now, she had come only with a small entourage, as promised. She lifted her hand in a respectful greeting. "Lord Eddard Stark," she said, her voice carrying above the wind. "I thank you for permitting my landing." Ned inclined his head. "Daenerys Targaryen, welcome to the north." A brief smile touched her lips. "It is colder than I expected." Ned allowed himself a faint curve of the mouth. "It grows colder still, your grace. Winter is upon us." She glanced at the sky, where her dragon now swooped lower, the sunlight glinting off its scales. "Then let us make haste, for winter spares no one." In that moment, with the briny wind chilling them all, Ned felt an odd sense of destiny. There they stood, a Stark and a Targaryen, separated by decades of bloodshed and hatred, now forging a tenuous bond for the sake of a realm teetering on the brink of chaos. Robert's memory loomed like a shadow, but perhaps it was also a guiding star, reminding them of the cost of rebellion, of the cost of allowing madness to run unchecked. If Robert had once fought for a kingdom free of tyranny, then maybe this was the next step in that fight, forging alliances instead of stoking old vendettas. Ned drew in a breath, letting the sea air fill his lungs. He felt the tension of centuries in his bones, but he also felt a fragile hope, bright as the pale sun overhead. "Come," he said to Daenerys, gesturing up the path. "Winterfell awaits you. We have much to discuss and not a moment to lose." Daenerys nodded, her bearing regal despite the rough terrain. She signaled her men to follow, and thus began the ascent. The roar of the dragon mingled with the crash of the waves, as if the land and sky bore witness to a turning point in history. Behind them, Robb walked in step with Ser Barristan, while the Great Jon and the Unsullied eyed each other warily. The bannermen would gather. The negotiations would unfold. The North would decide if this Targaryen queen was worthy of its faith, and she would decide if the North's honor was as unyielding as its reputation. But in that moment, Eddard Stark allowed himself to believe that peace was possible, that the mistakes of one generation need not doom the next. The future of Westeros hung in the balance, poised between ice and fire. And just maybe, with honor and resolve, they could find a path that would spare the realm from the worst of its own history. He held that hope close as they climbed the winding path to where horses waited, each step echoing the careful promise they had forged across the sea. The Stark-Targaryen pact, born in the memory of Robert Baratheon and the dream of a united kingdom, was now set in motion. Only time would reveal whether it would save Westeros from its darkest enemies or unleash a storm of dragons and wolves that would shake the land to its foundations. But for now, at least, there was a glimmer of something that had long been absent from the realm, the faint but undeniable promise of a new dawn. Daenerys Targaryen felt the wind bite at her cheeks as she ascended the steep path from the rocky cove. The north was as cold as she had anticipated, but nothing could have prepared her for the stark beauty of it, the vast gray sky, the stony hills where hardy grasses bent in frigid gusts, the smell of pine and distant snow. She cast a glance backward at the waters below where her modest ships lay at anchor. She could see rows of men still unloading supplies, foodstuffs, tents, gear for the Unsullied. Yet her attention returned to the path before her, a winding course leading inland, watched over by Lord Eddard Stark and his sworn guards. Ned Stark walked beside Daenerys, his cloak snapping in the wind. Close behind them followed Robb Stark and Ser Barristan Selmy, and a few steps farther back came Missandei and a small detachment of Unsullied. Every footfall echoed with the tension of first impressions. The Northern Lord was courteous but reserved. She could sense that behind his politeness lay a cautious heart. She had no illusions that what they were attempting was unprecedented. For so many years, the North had viewed House Targaryen with suspicion and resentment, yet here they were, forging a meeting that might redefine the future of Westeros. Silence gripped the air until at last Daenerys said, "It is my first time in the land of my ancestors, Lord Stark, and I know the past weighs heavily between us." Ned's gray eyes flicked toward her. "The past is what it is. My father and brother died in King Aerys' halls. Your father's cruelties shaped Robert's rebellion, shaped all of us. Yet the realm is not the same as it was then. Nor are we." She inclined her head in agreement. "I hope we can be better than those who came before us." Ned nodded, though his face remained solemn. "I have told my bannermen as much. Some are more willing to listen than others, but they have agreed to let you speak your cause." They reached a flattened stretch of land where horses waited, their breath steaming in the crisp air. One was brought forward for Daenerys, but it shied at the scent of something unfamiliar, the odor of dragons, perhaps, clinging to her. She set a reassuring hand on its flank, murmuring soft words until it settled enough to let her mount. The entire time she felt the weight of watchful northern eyes upon her. Robb exchanged a glance with Ned and then turned to Daenerys. "We will ride inland for a few hours and camp. It is still some leagues to Winterfell. My father thought it best to meet you out here, far from prying eyes. White Harbor is also under scrutiny by the Lannister spies. We could not risk you sailing openly into port." Daenerys had no objections. Secrecy served them both. She nodded, and soon the group set off, heading northwest along a narrow, rugged road that meandered through scattered pines and wind-bent brush. Overhead, Drogon still circled, occasionally gliding low as though ensuring his queen remained safe. Every time the dragon's silhouette swept across the ground, Daenerys heard the startled gasps of some northern men who had accompanied Lord Stark's force as outriders. Though they tried to hide it, their awe and apprehension were plain. She could hardly blame them. Dragons had not flown over Westeros for nearly a century and a half, and the tales of fire and blood still haunted every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. They covered a good stretch of ground by late afternoon. The sun began to dip, brushing the horizon with pale gold, and the cold deepened. Daenerys found herself grateful for the heavier cloak that Missandei had convinced her to wear. At last, Ned Stark signaled a halt. They chose a small clearing shielded by a swath of ancient firs, the perfect place to raise tents for the night. As the camp took shape, Daenerys stood near a makeshift fire pit with Missandei, warming her hands while Barristan and Selmy spoke quietly with some of the Unsullied about guard rotations. The Northmen made their own small fires a respectful distance away, though a few had wandered closer out of curiosity. She saw how they looked at the Unsullied: confusion, uncertainty. Warriors without fear, so different from the sworn swords of Westeros. She caught Ned's eye across the clearing. He nodded to her once before returning to quiet conversation with Robb. There was something about his steady, unflinching demeanor that impressed her. She had known lords who strutted, who flaunted their power with gaudy airs, yet Ned Stark needed no theatrics. He radiated the same sort of stoic authority she had seen in the best of her own knights. Even in Essos, she had heard stories of his honor, how it transcended petty ambition. Perhaps that was why he had opened the door to her in the first place. Night settled in earnest, blanketing the camp in moonlight and the glow of small fires. Huddled in a fur-lined cloak, Daenerys sat with Missandei and Ser Barristan near one such fire while a cold wind stirred the pine needles above them. When Ned Stark approached quietly, she looked up from the flames. He had removed his cloak and draped it over his arm, revealing the simple but well-crafted leathers beneath. "Your Grace," he said, "I thought we might speak before turning in for the night. Would you walk with me?" Daenerys rose, nodding at Barristan in a silent gesture of reassurance. The old knight dipped his head, though his watchful gaze followed her as she moved away with Ned. Together, the two of them drifted from the heart of the camp to a spot where the moonlit forest stretched beyond. A sentinel pine, tall and ancient, loomed overhead, its branches creaking softly in the breeze. Aside from the distant crackle of fires, they were alone. For a time, neither spoke. Daenerys took in the stillness, listening to the soft hoot of an owl somewhere beyond the trees. At last, Ned turned to her, the lines of his face carved by the flickering light. He looked older than she had expected, streaks of gray in his hair, faint creases around his eyes. Yet something about that age lent him a certain gravitas. "Queen Daenerys," he said slowly, "I will not lie to you. This alliance we attempt is precarious. Many of my lords remain wary. Some nursed hatred for your house, for your father, for years beyond count." Daenerys folded her hands before her, her breath visible in the night air. "I know. I cannot undo the horrors of the Mad King. I can only show that I am not him. I am here to make common cause, not to burn and pillage." Ned watched her steadily. "You have asked for the North's support in your claim to the Iron Throne. You have offered us respect for our traditions, a guarantee of our autonomy. Yet there is a matter we have only touched upon, the Lannisters. They hold power in King's Landing enough to challenge your arrival if they learn of it. Are you prepared to face them directly?" Daenerys inhaled. She thought of the scars left by the Lannisters on this realm, of how Cersei and Tywin before her had woven cunning webs. "Yes, if there is no other way. But my hope is that if I arrive with allies, with the North at my side and perhaps other great houses that see reason, we might reduce the bloodshed. If the Lannisters will not yield, then I must press the issue. The Iron Throne was stolen from my family, but I come to claim it in the name of a new peace. Not a mindless slaughter." Ned's eyes flicked to the canopy of pines, as though weighing her words against old memories. "The realm has seen enough slaughter. If you truly mean to rule with wisdom, you will need more than just the north. You will need alliances with the Riverlands, the Vale, perhaps even the Stormlands. Yet each has its own entanglements. Daenerys nodded. One step at a time. I asked for the North's help first because you are known for your honor and because she hesitated. Because of Robert Baratheon. A soft, rueful sigh escaped Ned. Robert was my friend and my king for many years. But I watched him become embittered by his hatred for your house. It shaped him into a man I barely recognized. Part of me wonders if, had he seen you, truly seen you, he might have let go of that hatred. And part of me fears he never could. They stood in contemplative silence, the wind rustling their cloaks. Daenerys considered how Robert's name had been invoked so often in her youth, always in the context of the usurper. Viserys had raged about him, blaming him for all their ills. But now, after many trials, she found herself seeking an alliance that might, in some roundabout way, honor the best of what Robert had once stood for. A realm free of the Mad King's tyranny. Your friend left a complicated legacy, Daenerys said quietly. Perhaps we can shape something better from it. Ned regarded her for a long moment, then inclined his head as though acknowledging the magnitude of her words. Let us see if that is possible. They returned to the camp where the fires burned low, men dozing in their bedrolls. A hush settled, broken only by an occasional murmur from a guardsman or the distant cry of an animal. Daenerys slipped into her tent, which Missandei had overseen, a simple canvas structure warmed by braziers. She wondered if she would sleep at all, her mind so heavy with thoughts of what tomorrow would bring. Beyond the thin walls, she heard the soft clinking of unsullied armor and the whisper of the wind. For the first time in a long while, she felt a fragile sense of hope mixing with her usual undercurrent of resolve. If Ned Stark could speak to her as he had tonight, openly and without guile, then perhaps they truly stood on the cusp of something new. She drifted into a fitful sleep, dreaming of dragons and dire wolves coursing across fields of snow, their paths converging beneath the pale sun. They broke camp at dawn. A dull light spread across the horizon, revealing a sky blanketed with slate-gray clouds. Daenerys mounted her horse once more, with Ned and Robb taking the lead. Barristan and Selmy rode close at her side, ever protective, while Missandei followed with a retinue of Unsullied. The northern outriders fanned out, scouting the way. Overhead, Drogon still soared, a living specter that occasionally vanished behind thick clouds, only to reappear with a roar that set the horses to shifting and snorting. The journey continued through rolling, forested hills, the trees growing denser as they pressed inland. Daenerys glimpsed glimpses of wildlife, a stag darting between birches, a fox slinking over a rise. Once, in a clearing, she saw a group of children from a nearby farm cluster at the edge of the road, wide-eyed at the sight of armed men and the dragon overhead. They whispered in wonder at the silver-haired woman who rode among them, but they did not speak. It reminded Daenerys of the small folk of Essos, only less fearful and more curious. It struck her that she was an invader in all but name, yet here the people were not cowering, but watching with uncertain fascination. By noon, the land began a gentle descent, and Robb pointed out the distant shape of a squat tower, a watchtower that marked the beginning of Winterfell's domain. The wolfswood stretched beyond, thick with pines and oaks, a labyrinth of green and brown that might easily hide entire armies. Daenerys felt a twinge of awe at the sheer scale of the north. It was not lush like the Reach, nor placid like the rolling hills of the Riverlands. It was raw and untamed, perfectly matching the quiet ferocity of its people. They reached Winterfell just as dusk approached. The castle rose from the wintry expanse like a sentinel of stone and ancient timber. Daenerys noticed the swirling plumes of steam rising from the hot springs that warmed its walls, a detail she had read about but never truly envisioned. It gave the place an otherworldly quality, as though the castle breathed warmth into the cold air. Though her arrival was meant to be discreet, she could see movement along the battlements. Archers peered down, and stable hands hurried forward to receive the horses. The main gates yawned open, revealing a courtyard half filled with onlookers. Knights and guards, a handful of highborn men and women with furs wrapped tight against the chill. Winterfell was not hosting a grand reception. This was no time for pageantry, but it was clear that the castle's inhabitants knew something momentous was happening. Daenerys dismounted. Almost at once, her breath caught as she caught sight of large, gray-furred direwolves trotting into the courtyard. Two of them, one with pale fur flecked in white, the other darker. They belonged to Robb Stark and, she guessed, to some of the other Stark children. Indeed, a slight figure with auburn hair came forward, a girl in her mid-teens. watching Daenerys with an uncertain expression. Beside her stood another, younger girl with brown hair and bright eyes. Daenerys recognized them from descriptions. Sansa Stark, the elder, and Arya, the younger. 2 more children were absent. Bran, who was rumored paralyzed from a fall, and Rickon, still very young. Standing behind the 2 girls was Catelyn Stark, her bearing regal as she kept a polite distance, though her eyes flicked between Daenerys and Ned, doubt and curiosity mingling there. Daenerys felt her heart pound. This was the family that had once suffered so terribly under her father's reign. The family that had lost loved ones to Targaryen madness. Yet here they stood prepared, if not fully willing, to greet her. She glanced at Ned, who offered a small nod of encouragement, then stepped forward. "Queen Daenerys," Ned said, raising his voice so those gathered could hear. "Welcome to Winterfell. It has stood for thousands of years, and I pray the old gods watch over it still." He gestured to his wife. "This is my lady, Catelyn Stark." Catelyn inclined her head. "Your Grace," she said, her tone cool but polite. "You are a guest in our home." Daenerys returned the gesture, pressing a hand lightly to her chest. "My lady, thank you for receiving me. I come in peace." The words felt inadequate to the weight of the moment, but Catelyn nodded. "We shall see that your people are given lodging, and that you are comfortable." Daenerys caught the flicker of caution in the lady's eyes. She could only imagine the heartbreak that had once racked this family. The father and elder brother burned alive by Aerys, the war that followed. She steeled herself. Winning over Catelyn Stark might be just as crucial as winning over Ned and the Northern Lords. Sansa, poised like a budding court lady, curtsied shyly. Arya, on the other hand, gave a little half-bow that was more a brash dip of the head than anything properly ladylike. Daenerys managed a warm smile, trying to put them at ease, though she suspected only time would soften their guarded hearts. Robb and Ned saw to it that Daenerys and her closest advisors were led into the castle proper. She stepped past the ancient walls, feeling a surge of warmth from the geothermal heat that coursed through hidden channels. The corridors were lit by torches, their flickering glow revealing tapestries of wolves and winter scenes. Servants scurried to prepare rooms once reserved for visiting lords of the realm. Drogon remained outside, circling in the gray sky. Rhaegal and Viserion, who had followed at a distance, perched in the trees beyond the walls, or soared overhead in lazy arcs, curious about this new territory. Daenerys knew their presence would set the castle on edge. Yet so far, no one had loosed an arrow. It was a tentative sign of trust. She and her retinue were shown to a suite of guest chambers in a wing of the castle where the stone walls radiated a surprising degree of heat from within. Missandei marveled at it, pressing her palm to the stone as Barristan gave an approving nod at the architectural ingenuity. Daenerys placed her traveling bag aside and took in the sturdy furniture, the thick rugs underfoot, the wolf motifs carved into bedposts and chests of drawers. There was no mistaking whose domain this was. At length, Ned Stark requested her presence in the Great Hall to meet with several of the prominent northern lords who had gathered. "Some have traveled from far reaches, despite the snow and distance," he said. "They wish to hear your words." Daenerys collected herself. She chose an outfit of deep blue wool that Missandei had set out, something warm yet regal. She did not wear the silks and jewelry of Essos, for she knew the North found no favor in lavish display. A few pieces of silver ornamentation wove through her braids, a subtle statement that she was still a queen. Then she walked with her head held high, flanked by Barristan and Missandei. Quietly, they descended into the great hall. A hush greeted them as they entered. Torches flared along the walls, illuminating the massive open space. The gray stone floors bore the scars of centuries of footfalls, feasts, and battles. At the far end, upon the raised dais, stood the ancient high seat of the Starks. Ned and Catelyn had positioned themselves near it, and Robb beside them. Gathered around the hall were the great Jon Umber, Roose Bolton of the Dreadfort, Rickard Karstark, Meege Mormont, and other notables of the North. She saw curious eyes, skeptical eyes, and more than one pair of outright hostile eyes. Ned cleared his throat. Lords and ladies of the North, this is Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, who has come to us in peace. Daenerys took a breath. She recalled the speeches she had made in Essos when freeing slaves, the declarations of intent she had uttered in various tongues. But this was different. This was Westeros, her ancestral home, and these men and women were not slaves yearning for freedom. They were proud, wary nobles waiting to judge her sincerity. She stepped forward. My lords, my ladies, she began, voice echoing in the vaulted hall. I stand before you as a Targaryen, yes, but also as one who has seen the horrors of tyranny and war. I know the pain my father caused, and I do not seek to deny it. I come not to excuse his crimes, but to offer a different way, one guided by honor and justice rather than fear. She paused, scanning the faces. The great Jon looked intrigued, arms folded across his broad chest. Roose Bolton's expression was inscrutable, his pale eyes flicking over her like a vulture sizing up carrion. Midge Mormont wore a small frown, but Daenerys sensed curiosity behind it. I have asked Lord Stark, Daenerys continued, for a chance to prove that the Targaryen name need not be a curse upon the realm. My father's reign ended in fire and blood. I would see a new beginning. King's Landing is ruled now by a boy king whose regents and protectors conspire to keep power in their hands. They care little for the safety of the realm. They allow raids upon the small folk, they let the Iron Throne's coffers run dry to fill their own pockets, and they do not heed the warnings from beyond the wall. Winter is coming, and with it dangers we cannot afford to ignore. Those last words, winter is coming, seemed to land heavily among the assembled lords. It was their own motto used in an unfamiliar mouth. Some stirred uncomfortably, but Daenerys pressed on. I have heard what lies beyond the wall, she said, and I do not dismiss it as mere tales. I have seen creatures in my travels across the narrow sea that many would call myth, but I know them to be real. My dragons, for one. If dragons can return to the world, why not other old evils? We must unite if we hope to stand against them. She drew herself up. To that end, I propose an accord. Let House Stark and the North stand beside House Targaryen, not in chains of fealty, but in mutual purpose. I will acknowledge the North's ancient customs and give due respect to its lords. In return, I ask that you support my claim against those who would see the throne remain in the grip of Lannister greed. I would not rule as my father did. I would rule with the guidance of those who hold honor dear, and the Starks have ever been so. A silence followed, thick with the unspoken weight of the proposition. Daenerys could almost hear the beat of her own heart. She waited, letting the echoes of her words settle. At last, the great Jon was the first to break the hush. He roared a laugh. So sudden it startled some of the onlookers. The lass has the tongue of a diplomat, eh? I'll grant her that. He stepped forward, massive arms swinging. But words are wind, as they say. How do we know you won't take up after your father when the fancy strikes? Daenerys met his gaze squarely. You do not. You can only see my deeds. In Essos I freed thousands from bondage. I toppled slavers, not to claim personal wealth, but to ensure that no one would live under a whip if I could prevent it. You can speak to those who traveled with me, Barrist and Selmy, Jorah Mormont, others from your own land. They have seen what I've done. I ask you to judge me on that, not on my father's crimes. At the mention of Jorah Mormont, Midge Mormont's frown deepened and she exchanged a glance with someone near her. Perhaps she had her own judgments about the disgraced knight. Still, she said nothing yet. Roose Bolton, with a voice like silk, interjected, Your father's crimes were not inconsequential, your grace. Nor were your brother Rhaegar's actions, which helped ignite the rebellion. Must the North bend the knee simply on your promise that you will be different? A flicker of tension ran through Daenerys. Bolton's presence was unnerving in a subtle way. He exuded a cold calm, almost predatory. She had heard rumors of his house's methods in dealing with foes. Still, she answered evenly. I do not demand bending of the knee, my lord, only a partnership. If you find me wanting, you may withhold your swords. But I believe we can forge a future that spares our children yet another cycle of war. A stir ran through the hall. Some of the lesser lords shifted as though uncertain how to respond. Ned Stark raised a hand for silence and the murmurs receded. Lords of the North, he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. You know me. You know I would not invite a Targaryen into our midst lightly. I have spoken with the Queen. I believe her intentions are genuine. Catelyn stood beside him, her expression guarded but resolute. I too am wary, she said softly, yet I trust my lord husband's judgment. We have seen the Lannisters undermine the realm. We have felt their stranglehold on King's Landing. The North has bled for southern schemes before. If the Queen can help us break that grip and if she shows respect for our customs, perhaps we can find a better way. The great Jon let out a rumbling exhale. I'll not deny the Lannisters are a plague. Nor will I deny that the realm might unite behind dragons once again. But you'll forgive an old war dog for wanting proof. Robb spoke up then, stepping forward. We have that chance, my lord. The Queen's dragons are here, tamed, loyal to her. If she wished to burn Winterfell, she could have tried already. Yet she has shown restraint. He cast a quick look at Daenerys. My father and I traveled to Braavos to meet her. We were not seized. We were not threatened. She spoke of alliances, not conquest. That gave the hall pause. The mention of Braavos clearly interested them. Some must have suspected clandestine communications but never had the details confirmed. A low hum rippled among the lords and ladies. Daenerys seized the moment. I will remain here, in Winterfell, she said, as your guest, to discuss the terms of our alliance. Let any who wish to speak with me do so openly. Question me. Learn my intent. Meanwhile, if any among you wishes to see a dragon with your own eyes, I will not hide them. I know we have much to overcome, but I offer you transparency. In the hush that followed, Ned's voice carried. Let us weigh this carefully. The Queen will have a seat at our table, so we may speak of common goals. Our greatest threat may well lie to the north beyond the wall. If we do not prepare, all our differences will matter little when the snows fall and the dead rise. The Lannisters, the Targaryens, the Starks, none of that will save us from the great other. Daenerys heard the note of dark conviction in his words. She had gleaned from Robb just how seriously Ned and many Northerners took the stories from beyond the wall. She glanced around, noting that some lords looked uneasy at the mention of the dead. Others seemed skeptical. But no one scoffed out loud. Finally, Midge Mormont crossed her arms. If this alliance means the North is prepared for what's coming, and if it means the Lannisters' hold on the throne can be broken without drowning the realm in blood, I'll hear more. But know this, your grace, the North is not a docile fief. We remember what your father did to the Stark family. We will not be deceived by sweet words if your actions betray them. Daenerys inclined her head. Nor would I expect you to be deceived. Judge me by my deeds. That, it seemed, was enough for now. The gathering broke into small pockets of discussion, the lords murmuring among themselves. Ned gestured for Daenerys to accompany him to a side chamber where they might speak more comfortably. Robb, Catelyn, and a few of the more amenable bannermen trailed behind. They settled in a smaller, warmer room off the great hall, a solar of sorts, furnished with a long table and a banked hearth. Servants brought mulled wine and trays of salted fish, dark bread, and roast venison. Daenerys took a seat near the fire, grateful for the warmth seeping into her bones. Barristan stood watch by the door, and Missandei found a place at Daenerys' side, ever alert. Ned began, speaking in a low voice. You have seen how the lords respond. Some might accept you. Others, like Bolton, will be cautious or even secretly hostile. You must tread carefully. Daenerys nodded. I expected as much. I do not shy from the challenge. Catelyn examined Daenerys with an intensity that felt almost maternal. Your Grace, I appreciate your courtesy, but you must understand the North's position. We have lost many men in wars fought because of southern intrigues. If we ally with you, if we kneel to you, then we must be sure you will not lead us into another war that destroys our homes. The Queen's gaze remained steady. I do not ask you to kneel but to stand with me as equals. The war I wage against the Lannisters is not one of my choosing. They will not relinquish power voluntarily, and I believe they will continue to harm the realm to preserve their position. If we cannot find a diplomatic solution, battle may be inevitable. But with the North at my side and I hope other honorable houses, we can minimize the damage. I have no wish to see the small folk suffer or the land scorched. I've fought in Essos to free people from oppression, not to impose my own. Catelyn's mouth tightened. She sipped her mulled wine, her posture still tense. You speak well. We shall see if your actions match your words. Robb, standing across the table, gestured to the map pinned to the wall, a map of the North and the lands below. If you mean to press your claim, you will need to address the Riverlands, the Vale, and potentially the Stormlands. The Riverlands suffered heavily under the war with the Lannisters. Lord Walder Frey remains a thorny figure, and House Tully has been weakened. My mother's brother, Edmure Tully, holds Riverrun, but the Riverlords may not rally easily to a Targaryen queen. The Vale remains under the guardianship of Lady Lysa Arryn, who, he glanced at Catelyn, may not be easily persuaded. A shadow passed over Catelyn's face at the mention of her sister. Lysa is reclusive since her husband's death. She clings to her son and is suspicious of outsiders. It might be difficult to sway her unless she sees immediate threat to the Vale or an immense benefit. Daenerys nodded thoughtfully. Then perhaps I should send envoys or even travel myself discreetly to these regions. But first, let us solidify our own accord. If the North stands with me, that alone will shift the balance of power. Ned exhaled. Agreed. Let us speak of the specific terms, so we might present a united front to the bannermen. He glanced at Daenerys. You mentioned autonomy for the North. She inclined her head. Yes, when I take the Iron Throne, I will recognize the North's right to self-govern in local matters. Taxes and levies will be fair and proportionate. The old gods will be respected. I will not appoint a Lannister or any Southern lord as Warden of the North. House Stark or its chosen representative will hold that title, as has been tradition for centuries. Ned looked to Catelyn, then Robb, and saw no objection. That is well. I would also ask that you abide by our choice in the matter of justice. The North has its own methods, and we prefer to handle criminals locally. We ask that the Crown not interfere unless absolutely necessary. Daenerys considered, recalling how each region in Essos had its own laws. I agree, provided the laws do not conflict with the realm's fundamental rights. Such as slavery, she added pointedly, though slavery was not practiced in Westeros. But I trust the North well enough. The rest is simpler, Ned continued. We will grant safe passage to any Targaryen forces that land in the North, provided they abide by your oath not to harm our people. We will store supplies if needed and offer what help we can when you march south. But I must be frank. If the war drags on, our resources are limited. Winter is near, and the North can ill afford to send all our men far away. Daenerys inclined her head. I understand. I do not intend to strip the North of its defenses. We must remember the threat of the White Walkers, after all. When war comes, it may come from two directions. A grim silence ensued, each person mindful of the land beyond the wall. At length, Ned cleared his throat. Very well. Let us draft these terms clearly. Then we will present them to the bannermen over the coming days. If all goes well, we can formalize the alliance. Daenerys could sense the caution in the room, but also a faint, growing sense of resolution. She offered a small smile. Thank you. I will do all I can to earn your trust. In the meantime, if your lords wish to speak to me, they will, Catelyn said, her tone still guarded. Expect pointed questions. I welcome them, Daenerys replied. Thus ended the first of many discussions. Over the days that followed, Daenerys made her presence felt in Winterfell. She rose early, often walking the battlements or visiting the Godswood to observe the weirwood tree with curious reverence. Sometimes she caught a glimpse of the Stark children, Arya darting about with wooden swords, Sansa attending to her lessons in etiquette, young Rickon trailing behind the direwolves, though he eyed Daenerys from afar. Bran remained secluded in his chambers or in the wheelchair contraption that allowed him to move about, aided by Hodder. Catelyn was often with him, or else conferencing with Ned about castle affairs. Daenerys sensed the grieving mother within Catelyn, still raw over past injuries to her family, but also a woman of fierce loyalty to her husband's judgment. Daenerys found allies, too. She spoke at length with Maester Luwin about the White Walkers and the old prophecies. She listened to the Greyjoy's boisterous stories of battles gone by, occasionally winning a hearty laugh from him when she recounted how the Unsullied had shattered the Yunkish slave soldiers. She found a certain courtesy in Rickard Karstark, though sorrow lingered in his voice when he mentioned the lost members of his house. Roose Bolton remained aloof, speaking seldom but listening much. Each conversation was a piece of the puzzle, and Daenerys strove to fit them all together, forging a tapestry of trust. During this time, her dragons roost outside the walls, occasionally stirring curiosity and fear in equal measure. Drogon was the boldest, landing in the courtyard once with a whoosh of hot air that sent stable hands scattering. From that day forward, watchers on the walls kept a wary eye for approaching dragons, lest they cause a panic. Yet no serious incident occurred. Daenerys made it clear to them, through gentle but firm coaxing, that they were not to harm any inhabitants or livestock. Sheep were provided at intervals, a compromise to keep the dragons fed without letting them range too far. The sight of the creatures devouring a sheep outside the gates was horrifying to some, mesmerizing to others. One evening, after a lengthy meeting with northern lords, Daenerys found herself alone in the Godswood, seeking a brief moment of calm. The weirwood stood silent, its carved face seeming to watch her with ancient eyes. She placed a hand upon its trunk, noting the smoothness where countless hands had pressed before. She wondered about the old gods, whether they might judge her kindly or see in her the reflection of her father's sins. A voice came softly behind her. They say the old gods watch, even if they do not speak. Daenerys turned to see Arya Stark emerging from behind a mossy stump, a curious light in her gray eyes. She was young, perhaps barely into her teens, yet she carried herself with a confidence that belied her years. She wore trousers and a tunic, her hair tied back messily. A wooden practice sword hung at her hip. Daenerys inclined her head in greeting. "Arya, have you come to pray?" The girl shrugged. "Sometimes I come here to think. My father says the old gods are always listening." She stepped closer, regarding Daenerys curiously. "You have real dragons. I've seen them flying. Could you ride them?" Daenerys allowed a small smile. "I have. Drogon, the largest, is strong enough to carry me. But it's not easy. Dragons are not horses. They demand respect, and sometimes they have minds of their own." Arya's face lit up. "That's amazing. I wish I could ride one. Then I'd fly away and see the world." Her words carried a bittersweet tone, as though she often dreamed of escaping the constraints of a lady's life in Winterfell. Daenerys thought of her own youth, she and Viserys, drifting between cities in Essos, never truly at home. "Traveling can be exciting," she said quietly, "but it can also be lonely. Home is valuable." Arya's gaze flicked to the weirwood. "This is my home, but sometimes I think I'd rather be out there, having adventures. Father says one day I'll marry a lord and have proper duties." Daenerys studied the girl's expression. So eager, so restless. She reminded Daenerys a little of herself, of how she had once dreamed of something beyond her brother's tyranny. "Your father is a good man," she said gently. "He wants what is best for you. But each of us must find our own path, I think." Arya nodded, then hesitated. "Is it true you want to be queen?" "I am a queen," Daenerys corrected softly. "But yes, I want to sit the Iron Throne. Not just for power's sake, but because I believe I can rule better than those who do now." Arya tilted her head. "If you become queen, will you make father fight for you?" The question carried an edge of worry. Daenerys understood. "I will not force him, nor any of the North, to die needlessly. But the Lannisters will not simply give up. If it comes to war, I will do everything in my power to end it swiftly and spare lives. I have no desire to see your father lost to a southern battlefield." Arya mulled that over. Then, "I hope you're right. And I hope you win quickly." She fiddled with her wooden sword, then glanced up. "If you do take the throne, what then?" Daenerys exhaled. "Then I try to mend a broken realm. There are thousands of people who need fair laws, safe roads, a chance to live without fear. I want to help them. And I will need strong allies, the best people around me. Perhaps your father, or Robb, or Sansa might serve the realm in King's Landing, if they choose." Arya wrinkled her nose as if the thought of Sansa at court was amusing. Then she nodded. "I suppose that could be good if it's not just more southern nonsense." She paused, her young face suddenly thoughtful. "All right, I should go. Mother says it's improper for me to be out here alone." Daenerys watched as Arya slipped away, nimbly hopping across a route before vanishing into the trees. She felt a pang of affection for the spirited girl, a sense of kinship that transcended the differences in their ages and stations. Perhaps the old gods, silent in their watchfulness, had arranged that brief meeting to remind Daenerys of the people for whom she claimed she wished to rule. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Winterfell began to shift. More lords trickled in, summoned by Ned Stark. They arrived with small retinues, some braving the journey from the far corners of the north. The great hall grew busier, the courtyard abuzz with talk of the Targaryen queen. Daenerys found herself in negotiations with northern leadership, hammering out the finer points of the pact. Each clause was dissected, each potential conflict foreseen. Through it all, Ned and Robb presided, offering calm reason. Catelyn observed keenly, speaking up when needed to ensure nothing was overlooked. Slowly, the shape of a formal agreement took form. House Targaryen pledged to uphold the North's autonomy in local governance and customs. House Stark and its banner men pledged to support House Targaryen's claim to the Iron Throne, with arms if necessary. Daenerys vowed to wage war only against those who opposed her legitimate claim and to spare the smallfolk. She also vowed not to punish any house solely for their role in Robert's rebellion, provided they did not rise against her now. The North would maintain sufficient forces at home to guard against the threats beyond the wall but would send a contingent south should open war break out. If Daenerys claimed the Iron Throne successfully, she would name a Stark or another Northerner to a key position on her small council, ensuring the North's voice was always heard. Both parties acknowledged the threat beyond the wall as a priority that superseded internal politics, promising to unite their forces if that threat escalated. These terms were written and rewritten, sealed, and eventually presented to a council of Northern lords in Winterfell's Great Hall. Some argued fiercely against it, House Bolton's men, a few lesser houses that clung to the memory of war or who feared dragons above all else. But others, including House Mormont, House Karstark, House Serwyn, and the Manderleys, believed that forging this alliance was preferable to letting the Lannisters tighten their hold on the throne. In the end, Ned stood and delivered a speech that resonated in the hall. "My lords, we stand at a crossroads. We can cling to old hatreds and watch the Lannisters and their allies consolidate power, or we can shape the future. Queen Daenerys Targaryen has come in good faith, offering respect to the North. I have seen her dragons, I have heard her speak of justice, and I believe she means to keep her word. The North has ever been a land of honor. When we swear our oaths, we keep them. Thus, I propose we swear an oath to this queen who aims to protect the realm from southern tyranny and northern terrors alike. In return, she pledges to respect us and stand with us. If we do not stand together, winter will swallow us all." Silence followed. Then the Grey Jon rose, a grin breaking across his bristly face. "I'll be damned if I let the Lannisters bleed us dry while I do nothing. You have my sword." Midge Mormont, eyes fierce, declared that her house would follow if the queen truly honored the pact. Wyman Manderley sent a messenger earlier but had indicated cautious support if Ned Stark gave his word. One by one, the major lords voiced their stance. Roose Bolton remained cool, offering a measured acceptance tinged with aloof politeness, though Daenerys noted how he glided around the edges of the hall, stirring pockets of doubt. Still, the consensus was clear enough. The majority of Northern lords would side with House Stark's decision. At last, Daenerys herself rose to address them. She spoke simply, from the heart. "You have given me more trust than I expected. I swear before gods old and new, I will not betray that trust. When I am queen, I will remember that the North stood with me, and I will honor this alliance." A hush, then a smattering of approval. No roar of celebration, but a subdued, firm acknowledgement. In that moment, an official alliance was born. Aware of how fragile it remained, Daenerys kept her head high and her voice steady, her heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and determination. In the aftermath, the mood in Winterfell shifted yet again. Some lords departed, returning to their keeps to prepare for the possibility of war. Others lingered, curious to speak more with the Targaryen queen or finalize local matters with Ned. Daenerys spent much of her time conferring with Ned, Robb, and their advisors on the next steps. Communication with Essos was crucial. Her forces in Meereen and Astapor needed to know where and when to land if war came quickly. She also needed to send envoys south, quietly, to gauge support or hostility among other regions of Westeros. She was in the midst of such discussions one afternoon when an urgent rider arrived at Winterfell's gates, bearing news from the south. The man, mud-splattered and exhausted, stumbled into the courtyard demanding to see Lord Stark immediately. Word spread in a rush, and soon Daenerys found herself in a smaller gathering with Ned, Robb, and a few key lords, listening to the rider's breathless account. "Lord Stark," he panted. "The Lannisters. They are mustering forces near Harrenhal. Jaime Lannister leads them. They've called banners from the Westerlands and are massing men. Word is they suspect a Targaryen landing. They mean to march north if rumors prove true. They also search the narrow sea with hired ships. They fear the Dragon Queen's approach." Daenerys exchanged a look with Ned. The corners of his mouth tightened. Robb's jaw clenched. The Lannisters were moving more quickly than they'd hoped. "How large is their host?" Robb demanded. The rider wiped sweat from his brow. "Hard to say. 5,000, maybe more, encamped around Harrenhal. Lords from the Westerlands are trickling in, and rumors say the Crown has pledged the royal fleet to patrol the eastern coast. They've also dispatched envoys to Highgarden and the Reach, looking to secure an alliance. The Tyrells remain quiet, but the Lannisters must be pressing them. A heavy pause settled over the room. Daenerys felt her blood stir. This was the drumbeat of war, echoing across the miles. She had hoped for more time, but the Lannisters would not wait politely for her to gather strength. Ned's gaze went to Daenerys. If Jaime Lannister amasses an army at Harrenhal and secures alliances, the South becomes a tinderbox. If the Tyrells join them, they can field a massive host. Robb added, and if the Crown's fleet sweeps the narrow sea, your reinforcements from Essos might be cut off or forced to land far from safe harbors. Daenerys drew in a measured breath. Then we must move faster than we intended. My captains in Essos are prepared to sail on my command. If the Lannisters are gathering their might, perhaps the time has come for me to show them the North stands against them. I cannot let them trap me in a war of attrition. Ned nodded gravely. They likely mean to lure you or your forces into a direct clash. Harrenhal is a strategic location in the Riverlands. If the Riverlords see you march in, they might join or might remain neutral depending on how they judge your strength. If we move the Northern Army south, we risk being cut off from our home. But if we do nothing, the Lannisters may march north at their leisure. Daenerys's mind raced. She imagined the board, a mass of lion banners in the heart of the continent, a royal fleet patrolling the seas, and her own potential reinforcements sailing from Meereen with unsullied Dothraki and Sel sails. She also considered the swirling rumors of White Walkers beyond the wall. A precarious balancing act indeed. Robb's eyes darkened with determination. Father, if the Lannisters invade the Riverlands, we cannot sit idle. Those lands once belonged to House Tully, our kin. We must respond or we risk losing everything. If we show strength, other lords might rally to our side rather than yield to the Lannisters. Ned rubbed his chin, his posture tense. The question is how and where we deploy. The king in the north, if the realm still sees us that way, cannot simply vanish. But if we muster a great host, the north itself lies vulnerable. If the threat beyond the wall proves real, we must leave enough men to guard the realm. We also cannot starve ourselves in a drawn-out war. Daenerys looked from father to son. I do not intend to take your entire army, Lord Stark. Even a portion might suffice to show that the North stands with me. My own troops from Essos can provide the bulk. We can converge, perhaps, in the Crownlands or the Stormlands, somewhere we can secure a foothold that is not so far from the coast. The Lannisters expect me in the Riverlands, I suspect. Ned frowned in thought. That is possible. But the Stormlands are far from Harrenhal. We risk letting the Lannisters run rampant through the Riverlands. Innocent folk will suffer. Catelyn, who had entered quietly, spoke up, her voice low but firm. I know we must consider strategy, but if the Riverlands bleed once more, my brother will not forgive us. Nor will the Riverlords. We might lose them forever. Daenerys let out a breath. She hated the notion of letting innocents suffer under the Lannisters again. Was there a way to strike swiftly before Jaime built an unassailable force? If we can muster a swift force, we might move toward the Trident. Harrenhal's walls are formidable, but the fortress itself is cursed and large, difficult to hold in its entirety. If I bring the dragons, it may deter a siege from the Lannisters or turn a siege in our favor. Robb's brows rose. Facing a dragon is no small matter, even for the Kingslayer. If the dragons can harry their supply lines, we could force them to withdraw. Ned-eyed Daenerys. You would commit your dragons to that? She nodded. I cannot hide them. They are a central part of my power. But I will not burn cities or kill indiscriminately. The dragons can be used strategically to break lines or intimidate the enemy. I have done so before in Essos when necessary. A consensus formed in that chamber, though it was laced with anxieties. They would rally a partial host of Northern Bannermen, volunteers from the more enthusiastic houses, plus some from the Riverlands if Edmure Tully joined their cause. Daenerys would coordinate with her captains in Essos, planning a landing that would support this movement. She would bring enough forces to stand against the Lannisters on equal footing. Ned would remain in Winterfell or move as needed, carefully balancing the threat from beyond the wall with the need to support Daenerys. Meanwhile, Roose Bolton would be tasked with holding strategic points in the north, though Daenerys noted the flicker of concern when Ned entrusted him with any measure of autonomy. The next few days were a blur of activity. Ravens dispatched to White Harbor, to Riverrun, to loyal lords in the Vale. Scouts rode out to gather what news they could of Lannister movements. Daenerys spent hours poring over maps with Robb, comparing the known routes through the Riverlands, the positions of ancient strongholds, the timing required for her Essosi fleet to land. At times, she was keenly aware that every plan might unravel the moment the Lannisters made an unexpected move. Between these councils, she continued to sense the watchful eyes of the North upon her. Each day, more men seemed to accept her presence, if not fully embrace it. The rumors of a pact between ice and fire spread until even the children in the courtyard whispered that a dragon queen ate supper with the Starks. The tension was still there, an undercurrent of old resentments, but for now it was overshadowed by the urgent demands of the present. One evening, while reviewing the newest reports in the quiet of the library tower, Daenerys looked up to see Ned Stark approaching. He shut the heavy wooden door behind him and gave a slight bow of greeting. She rose from her seat at a long wooden table, parchment scattered around her. "How fares the planning?" he asked in a low voice. She pinched the bridge of her nose. "Weary?" "As well as can be expected. My captains in Essos say they can set sail within a fortnight, but the crossing could take weeks, depending on winds and if they must evade the royal fleet." Ned nodded. "We will keep our scouts posted along the coast. White Harbor's ships can screen for enemy galleys. Still, so many uncertainties." "War is full of uncertainties," Daenerys said, bitterness creeping into her tone. "I have no desire for it, yet here we are." Ned sighed, stepping forward. He tapped a piece of parchment that showed a rough sketch of the Riverlands, Harrenhal marked with an ominous black tower. "This fortress has long been a monument to folly. It was built by Harren the Black to withstand dragons, but Aegon the Conqueror brought them all the same and melted its towers. Now it belongs to the crown and the Lannisters claim it. There's a grim symmetry if you face Jaime Lannister there with your own dragons." Daenerys studied the smudged lines. "I know. If we can secure Harrenhal quickly, it could serve as a strong base from which to negotiate or push forward. But I must not overextend. A fortress that size can devour an army both in men and resources." Ned rubbed his chin. "We must see how many Riverlords will rise to help. We have reason to believe many loathe the Lannisters. The question is whether they loathe them enough to risk open rebellion." Daenerys glanced at him, suddenly reflective. "Lord Stark, do you ever regret the choices you made during Robert's rebellion? The alliances you formed that led to House Targaryen's downfall?" He was quiet for a long moment. "It was a different time. My father and brother were burned alive by your father. Lyanna had been taken by Rhaegar. I believed we had no choice but to rise against the crown. The realm was suffering under the Mad King and we fought to end that tyranny. But do I regret the bloodshed? Yes. War always leaves scars." She heard the genuineness in his voice, a man haunted by the memory of that conflict. "If Rhaegar had lived," she ventured, "do you think the outcome might have been different?" Ned closed his eyes briefly, as though recalling old ghosts. "Perhaps. Rhaegar was different from his father, or so many said. But we never had the chance to see if he could have been a better king. Robert's wrath was unstoppable after Lyanna's death. I suspect the war would have continued until it ended in tragedy, one way or another." Daenerys lowered her gaze to the parchments. Rhaegar's legacy loomed large in the history of her house. Some recalled him as noble and honorable, others as a man who sparked a realm-wide conflict. She thought of the heartbreaking tapestry of events, the line between right and wrong twisted by circumstance. Now she had a chance to rewrite that pattern. "We can't change the past," she said softly. "But we can try to shape a better future." Ned's hand, rough and scarred, rested on the table. "Yes, we can." They traded quiet words of strategy a bit longer, then Ned excused himself. Daenerys remained, gazing at the flickering candlelight on the old scrolls that charted the rivers and roads. "We can shape a better future," she told herself. But the path to that future would be paved with difficult choices and the swords of men who might die in her name. The weight pressed upon her heart. Yet she steeled herself once again, for the realm needed a ruler who cared for its people, not for personal glory. If she had to carry that burden, she would. Outside Winterfell's gates, the winter wind picked up, howling through the pines. Snow began to swirl, dusting the castle walls. Far overhead, Drogon soared, an ebony shadow against the darkening sky, while somewhere beyond the horizon, the Lannisters gathered their banners and the uncertain future of Westeros moved another step closer to the fateful clash of ice and fire. In the following week, the forging of the Stark-Targaryen pact became public knowledge throughout much of the north. Ravens took the announcement to outlying holdfasts. Rumors spread with traders who carried tales to the Riverlands and beyond. The Lannisters, it was said, reacted with alarm and fury, denouncing the Starks as traitors once more. King Joffrey, from the Red Keep, supposedly demanded Ned Stark's head, though none were sure if this was just the Boy King's empty threat or an actual directive. In Winterfell, Daenerys prepared for departure. The new alliance demanded that she move south to rally the Riverlords and possibly secure Harrenhal before Jaime Lannister could fortify his position. She would take half of the volunteered Northmen while Ned remained behind with the other half to keep watch on the wall. The arrangement was precarious. What if a sudden threat from the north forced Ned to recall more troops? Or if the Lannisters launched a surprise strike toward Moat Cailin, the key fortress that guarded the neck? But no plan was without risk. Daenerys and her advisors hammered out contingencies as best they could. Horses were gathered, supply lines set. Riders were sent to Riverrun, to House Mallister at Seaguard, to others who might join them. They planned to set forth within days. On the eve of her departure, Daenerys walked once more along Winterfell's battlements, gazing out over the snow-laced courtyard. Torches glimmered below, illuminating the swirl of white flakes drifting from the dark sky. She paused near a crenellation, inhaling the cold air that stung her lungs, and let her thoughts wander. Steps approached behind her. She turned to see Ned Stark, cloaked in fur, stopping a few paces away. He joined her at the battlements, looking out across his ancestral seat. "You will be leaving soon," he said quietly. Daenerys nodded. "Yes. We plan to depart at first light. I would stay longer, but—" "I understand," Ned said. He sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "Winterfell is your ally, Queen Daenerys. I pray the gods guide your path. My son Robb will ride with you along with many of our loyal men. Take care of them." She appreciated the trusting note in his voice. "I will. Robb is a capable leader, and I have no doubt he will prove vital in the campaigns to come." She studied Ned's features, the stoic set of his jaw, the gravity in his eyes. "Will you join us later, if circumstances allow?" "I might. But my duty lies here. The messages from the Night's Watch trouble me more each day. Rangers keep disappearing. Wildling movements have been spotted. If the worst is true about the White Walkers," he trailed off. "I must be ready." She placed a hand on his arm, a bold gesture, but one she hoped conveyed solidarity. "I will not forget the threat from the north. Once we have secured our position against the Lannisters, I promise I will turn my attention to the Wall. My dragons will be at your side if these ancient evils truly march south." Ned hesitated, then laid his gloved hand over hers, a rare show of personal warmth. "Thank you. Let us hope we can resolve the southern conflict swiftly. The true battle might be in the far north." They stood like that for a moment, the wind whispering around them, the night sky overhead dotted with faint stars. Daenerys felt the weight of history around them, the battered legacy of House Targaryen, the proud resilience of House Stark. Yet here they were, forging a path forward. She thought again of Robert Baratheon, of how he had once fought so fiercely to destroy her family. Would he curse them from beyond the grave, or would he at last understand that they were trying to save the realm from a new wave of tyranny? Eventually, Ned withdrew his hand, turning to descend the steps. Daenerys lingered a moment longer, letting the cold wind whip through her braids. Then she followed, returning to her chambers to rest before the journey south. The dawn was grim and pale. Snow had gathered in drifts against the walls, though it was not so deep as to impede travel. The courtyard was alive with activity, horses saddled, wagons packed, men and women preparing to ride out under the direwolf banner of House Stark. Joined now by the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen on a separate standard. Daenerys' heart quickened at the sight, feeling the significance of these two sigils side by side. Ice and fire indeed. Robb Stark rode up, his gray dire wolf, Grey Wind, padding alongside. The beast regarded Daenerys' silver mare with a curious tilt of the head. Robb himself looked resolute, wearing mail under a heavy cloak. "We're nearly ready, Your Grace," he said. "I'll command the vanguard. You and Ser Barristan can follow with the main column. My mother will remain here," Ned interrupted gently, appearing beside them. "She must help me manage the North's affairs. Arya and Sansa will stay as well for their safety. Bran and Rickon, too." Robb nodded. "Yes, father." He turned to Daenerys. "We'll follow the King's Road south until we near Moat Cailin, then proceed cautiously through the neck. The Crannogmen of House Reed have pledged to guide us. After that, it's the Riverlands." Daenerys took in the plan. "Lead on, Lord Stark." "I am ready." She mounted her mare. Drogon and her other dragons had been given the unspoken signal to follow overhead as they would for much of the journey. The northern men had grown more accustomed to the sight in recent weeks, but she still saw a few soldiers shift anxiously as Drogon soared overhead, letting out a roar that echoed across the castle walls. There would be no hiding their approach once they marched. The realm would know how Stark and the Targaryen queen moved in unity. At the gate, Ned Stark stood with Catelyn to bid them farewell. The rolling snows parted briefly, allowing the pale sun to glint off the steel of the soldiers' helms. Daenerys paused her horse beside Ned. "You have my thanks, Lord Stark," she said softly. "I will not disappoint you." Ned inclined his head, his expression composed, though there was a flicker of fatherly worry in his eyes as he watched Robb. "Go with the gods, both of you. May the old gods and the new keep you safe." Catelyn stood behind him, hands folded tightly. She managed a nod. "Bring my son home," she said to Daenerys in a tone that held both steel and plea. "Do not let this war devour him." Daenerys returned her gaze solemnly. "I will do my utmost, my lady." Then, with a final word, the gate swung open and the host began to move. Daenerys rode at Robb's side, Barristan and Selmy close behind, Missandei and a small contingent of Unsullied in the vanguard, and a great swirl of northern spearmen, archers, and knights trailing along the snaking road. The snow crunched beneath hooves and boots. Grey wind loped ahead, scouting, while the banners fluttered in the cold breeze. As they passed the outlying fields and crossed the first ridge, Daenerys glanced back to see Winterfell's sturdy towers silhouetted against the wintry sky, Ned Stark still standing atop the gatehouse, watching them go. She felt a pang of melancholy, though also a surge of determination. Their pact was sealed. Their fates now entwined. She whispered under her breath, almost a prayer, to whatever gods might listen, "Let this alliance stand. Let the realm be spared a worse fate." Southward they rode, carrying the dreams of ice and fire and the dim memory of a king who once fought so fervently that he could not let go of hatred. But now that memory might guide them to something new if only they could weather the storms ahead. The snow fell, the wind keened, and the north faded behind them, but Daenerys pressed on, heart aflame with purpose. The Game of Thrones was beginning in earnest, and she intended not just to play but to reshape the board forever.